Colonial America. Foundations of a Republic. The story of America does not begin in 1776, nor even in 1620. It begins in the restless ambition of empires and in the fragile hopes of people, searching for freedom, fortune, or survival. In the early 1600s, a handful of European powers saw a vast unknown continent, not as a home, but as a prize. To the English, Spanish, Dutch, and French, the New World was a field for empire, rich in land, timber, and faith. But to those who crossed the Atlantic, it was something far more personal, a place to begin again. The first permanent English settlement, Jamestown, was founded in 1607. It began not with glory, but with hunger, disease, and death. Men sent by the Virginia Company dreamed of gold, but found only swamp and struggle. By the winter of 1609, known as the Starving Time, nearly 90% of the settlers were dead. Yet the colony survived, saved by tobacco, the brown gold that would define the economy of the southern colonies. While Virginia grew under the rule of profit and crown, another colony took root far to the north, founded not by merchants, but by believers. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, driven by religious persecution in England. They came seeking a covenant with God, not a contract with investors. Their compact, the Mayflower Compact, was simple yet revolutionary: government by the consent of the governed. It was, in its humble way, the first breath of American self-rule. Through the 1600s, England's colonies multiplied: Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and the Carolinas. Each was born under different motives, different climates, and different faiths. The South grew on plantations and slave labor. The North thrived on trade, towns, and education. In between, colonies like Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681, became havens of tolerance, a radical idea in an age of kings. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, tension grew. The colonies were English, but not entirely. Distance and struggle bred independence. Colonists began governing themselves in assemblies, electing local leaders, and taxing their own people. To the English crown, these were subjects. To themselves, they were citizens. The 17th century was an age of contradiction. Slavery took deep root, with the first African captives arriving in Virginia in 1619, the same year as the colony's first representative assembly. Liberty and bondage were born side by side. It would be America's original sin, and the contradiction that would haunt its republic. As the 1700s dawned, the colonies stretched from Maine to Georgia. Their populations exploded from a few thousand to over 2 million by mid-century. Towns like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston became centers of trade and thought. Yet each colony still looked inward, loyal to its own laws, churches, and identity. The idea of America had not yet taken hold. Then came the Great Awakening, a spiritual revolution that swept the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield preached that salvation came not through kings or priests, but through personal faith. Their message lit fires in the hearts of common people and quietly prepared them to question authority in all its forms. Meanwhile, on the edges of empire, another power loomed. France held vast territories to the west, from Canada to Louisiana, and war between empires was inevitable. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, would unite colonists and British soldiers against a common enemy. When the smoke cleared, Britain stood victorious, but its empire was broken by debt. And so, London turned to the colonies for revenue through taxes, acts, and laws that would spark rebellion. But the roots of resistance ran deep, planted long before the Stamp Act or the Boston Tea Party. The colonies had already lived for more than a century by their own hands, farming their land, building their towns, and governing their lives. They had tasted freedom not as a gift, but as a habit. By the 1760s, America was no longer a chain of outposts. It was a civilization, young, defiant, and distinct. It had its own press, thinkers, universities, and markets. It had its own voice, a voice that no longer echoed that of Parliament or the king. When the Crown began tightening control, the colonies resisted not as rebels, but as heirs of English liberty. They argued not for anarchy, but for rights. The revolution would come later, but its spirit was already alive. In every church that preached conscience over kings. In every town meeting that elected its own leaders. And in every family that crossed the Atlantic in search of hope, the Republic had already begun. The story of colonial America is not just the story of British subjects in a distant land. It is the story of a people learning slowly, painfully, courageously how to rule themselves. From the swamps of Jamestown to the Puritan towns of New England, from the Quaker farms of Pennsylvania to the tobacco fields of Virginia, the foundation of a republic was laid long before independence. By 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Revolution was not a beginning, it was a conclusion. For more than a century and a half, America had been building a nation in silence. One vote, one sermon, one act of defiance at a time. The colonies were never merely subjects of empire. They were apprentices of freedom. And from their hands, the world's first modern republic would rise. The Revolution ignites. America's War for Independence, 1763 to 1783. When the cannons of the French and Indian War fell silent in 1763, the British Empire stood at the height of its power. From Canada to the Caribbean, from India to the Atlantic, the sun never set on King George's dominion. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of rebellion had been sown. The war had united the colonies under Britain's banner, but at a cost. The empire was buried in debt, and London looked across the Atlantic for repayment. The colonies, rich and growing, seemed the obvious source. But what Parliament saw as fair taxation, the colonists saw as betrayal. They had fought and bled beside British soldiers. They had defended the king's frontier, and now they were being treated as conquered subjects. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, taxing every printed document in America, from newspapers to marriage licenses. It was not the amount that angered the colonists, it was the principle. They had no representatives in Parliament, yet they were being taxed by it. Out of this injustice came a rallying cry that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. Crowds gathered in the streets of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Effigies of tax collectors were burned. The Sons of Liberty were born, ordinary men defying imperial authority. Under their pressure, the Stamp Act was repealed, but Britain did not retreat. It simply changed tactics. The Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed imports on glass, tea, and paper. Soldiers were stationed in American cities. Tension thickened. In March 1770, that tension exploded. British troops fired on unarmed civilians in Boston, killing 5. It was called a massacre, and in that moment, Boston became the heart of the resistance. Propaganda fanned the flames. Paul Revere's engravings spread across the colonies, depicting tyranny in red coats. But even as tempers flared, most colonists still saw themselves as loyal subjects. They wanted justice, not independence. Then, in 1773, the empire made another misstep. The Tea Act. It was meant to rescue the struggling British East India Company by giving it a monopoly on tea. To Americans, it was yet another insult. On a cold December night in Boston Harbor, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance the Crown could not ignore. London struck back with fury. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, shut down Boston's port, dissolved its government, and quartered troops in colonial homes. To Britain, it was punishment. To America, it was tyranny. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia the First Continental Congress. For the first time, America spoke with one voice. They demanded the restoration of rights, not rebellion. But the door to reconciliation was closing. The following spring, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. On the morning of April 19, 1775, they were met by a small band of militiamen in Lexington. A shot was fired, no one knew by whom. It became known as the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. Militia from across New England surrounded Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that farmers could stand against professional soldiers. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," went the order, and though the colonists lost the hill, they won something greater: confidence. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. They appointed George Washington, a tall, reserved Virginian with a soldier's discipline, as commander-in-chief. He took command of an army without supplies, without experience, and without a nation to fight for. Still, the idea of independence was not yet universal. Many colonists remained loyal to the crown. Others feared anarchy. But in early 1776, a pamphlet changed everything. Written by a self-taught Englishman named Thomas Paine, it was called Common Sense. It argued that kings were not divinely chosen. They were obstacles to freedom. "'Tis time to part," he wrote. And America listened. By July, the colonies had reached a breaking point. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. It declared that all men are created equal. That government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that when it becomes destructive of those ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. It was the most radical statement in human history. And it was treason. Britain responded with overwhelming force. Tens of thousands of troops landed in New York, supported by the world's most powerful navy. Washington's army was driven from the city, chased across New Jersey, and nearly destroyed. The revolution seemed doomed. But in December 1776, in the darkest winter, Washington struck back. Crossing the icy Delaware River, he surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton. It was a small victory, but it saved the cause. "These are the times that try men's souls," wrote Paine. And America endured. The war dragged on. Battles were won and lost. Brandywine, Germantown, Saratoga. In 1777, the Americans achieved a stunning victory at Saratoga, convincing France to enter the war as an ally. The revolution was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was an international war. Yet even with French support, the struggle was brutal. The winter at Valley Forge tested Washington's army beyond endurance. Freezing, starving, and diseased, the soldiers held the line. Out of that suffering came discipline and unity, forged under Washington's steadfast command and the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who transformed a militia into an army. By 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Cornwallis found himself trapped, Washington's army closing from the land, the French fleet blocking the sea. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. After 8 long years, the impossible had been achieved. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. 13 colonies had defied an empire and won. But the revolution had created more than independence. It had created an idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that liberty was not a gift from kings, but a birthright. As Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, he became the embodiment of that principle, power given back to the people. The world watched in disbelief as a victorious general laid down his sword instead of seizing a crown. The American Revolution was not perfect. It left slavery untouched, women voiceless, and native lands unprotected. But it unleashed a force that would never again be contained: the belief that freedom could be built, defended, and expanded by the governed themselves. From Lexington to Yorktown, from Jefferson's pen to Washington's sword, a republic had been born, fragile, flawed, but immortal in its promise. The revolution ignited not only a war, but an idea. And that idea would set the world on fire. The Federalist experiment. Building a nation 1783 to 1797, the guns of Yorktown had fallen silent. The war was over, but the peace had only begun. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States of America, a name once whispered in rebellion, was now recognized among the nations of the world. But for all its triumph, the new republic stood upon uncertain ground. The war had united 13 colonies in spirit, not in structure. What bound them together was not government, but victory, and victory fades quickly. The young nation faced a terrifying question. Could freedom survive without the hand of a king? The first attempt to answer that question came in the form of the Articles of Confederation. Ratified in 1781, even before the war's end, it was a government designed in fear of power. The Articles gave Congress the ability to declare war, sign treaties, and manage foreign relations, but not to tax, enforce laws, or even regulate trade between states. There was no president, no national courts, and no authority strong enough to hold the Union together. At first, it seemed noble government without tyranny, but soon it proved unworkable. The states acted like independent countries, imposing tariffs on one another, printing worthless currencies, and ignoring Congress's appeals for funds. The Army went unpaid. Veterans returned home to debt and foreclosure. The promise of liberty was collapsing under the weight of chaos. In 1786, that chaos erupted into open defiance. In western Massachusetts, a farmer and former soldier named Daniel Shays led an uprising against taxes and debt collectors. They called it Shays' Rebellion. To many Americans, it was a warning proof that liberty without order was anarchy. To others, it was a cry for justice, proof that the government of the Confederation had failed its people. The rebellion was crushed, but its echo reached Philadelphia. Leaders across the states realized that without unity, the revolution itself would be lost. Something had to change. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to draft a new system of government. They gathered in secrecy under the hot, humid air of Independence Hall, the same room where the Declaration had been signed 11 years before. Among them were men who had fought the Revolution with words and ideas: George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin. Their mission was to repair the Articles of Confederation. What they created instead was a new constitution, a daring experiment in balanced power. The United States Constitution divided authority among three branches: a legislative branch to make laws, an executive to enforce them, and a judicial to interpret them. No one branch could dominate the others. Each was checked and balanced by the rest. At its core was the principle that sovereignty rested not in kings or parliaments, but in we, the people. The debates were fierce. Small states feared domination by large ones. Slaveholding states demanded protection for their property. Compromise became the lifeblood of the convention, the Great Compromise, giving each state equal representation in the Senate and population-based representation in the House. The Three-Fifths Compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation, a grim reminder that liberty was still incomplete. After 4 months of argument, on September 17, 1787, the delegates signed the Constitution. It would take 9 states to ratify it, and the battle for ratification would prove as divisive as any war. Those who supported the new Constitution called themselves Federalists. They believed that only a strong central government could preserve the Union. Those who opposed it, the Anti-Federalists, feared that such power would destroy liberty itself. To win the people's trust, 3 Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. Published in newspapers across the states, they argued that the Constitution was not a threat to freedom, but its safeguard. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, wrote Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Slowly, persuasion prevailed. By 1788, enough states had ratified the document. The experiment would begin. In 1789, George Washington, the man who had led the revolution, was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. When he took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the crowd below wept. For the first time in modern history, a nation was founded not on bloodline, but on consent. Washington understood the fragility of what they had built. His presidency would define the shape and tone of the new republic. He created the first cabinet with Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. Around this table sat the competing visions of America's future. Jefferson's vision of an agrarian democracy, independent and simple, and Hamilton's vision of an industrial power united by finance and trade. Hamilton's economic plan saved the nation from bankruptcy. He created a national bank, assumed state debts, and established public credit policies that strengthened the federal government but stirred fierce opposition. Jefferson saw it as corruption, power favoring the rich and eroding the liberty of the farmer. Their rivalry would define America's first political divide: Federalist versus Republican, central power versus states' rights. At the same time, Washington faced foreign threats and domestic rebellion. In 1791, Congress imposed a tax on whiskey, a move that outraged frontier farmers. The Whiskey Rebellion erupted in western Pennsylvania, echoing the defiance of Shays. But this time, the government was no longer powerless. Washington rode at the head of 13,000 troops, and the rebellion melted away. The message was clear: the Republic could enforce its laws. Yet Washington, ever wary of power, refused to let it consume him. He served 2 terms, then voluntarily stepped down, setting a precedent that would last more than a century. In his farewell address, he warned the nation against the dangers of partisanship and foreign entanglement. His words would echo across generations. By the time he left office in 1797, the experiment had survived its infancy. The Constitution had been tested and endured. The economy was stable. The government had authority. The world had witnessed something unprecedented: a revolution not only won, but sustained. Still, beneath the triumph, the fractures remained. Sectional tensions between North and South, divisions between Federalist and Republican, arguments over slavery, commerce, and identity all lay dormant, waiting to erupt. But for a brief and fragile moment, the dream of liberty and union stood unbroken. A republic, built from rebellion, had taken its first steps. The Revolution had won independence. The Federalist era had built a nation. And from the vision of Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson, the United States emerged not yet perfect, but enduring in its promise that free people could govern themselves, and that government could serve liberty, not dominate it. It was, as one observer called it, the great experiment, and against all odds, it had begun to succeed. Adams and Jefferson, The Crisis of Freedom, 1797 to 1801. The year was 1797. George Washington, the soldier who had refused a crown, stepped down from power, leaving behind a nation still finding its voice. For the first time in history, the world watched a miracle unfold: a peaceful transfer of power between free men, not monarchs. The mantle of the presidency passed to John Adams, a revolutionary patriot, philosopher, and Washington's former vice president. He was honest, stubborn, and fiercely independent, a man who believed in order above passion, in law above popularity. But Adams inherited not the unity of a new republic, but the storm of division. 2 visions of America now stood opposed. On one side, Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, who believed that stability required a strong national government, one aligned with commerce, cities, and Britain. On the other, Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who dreamed of a rural republic of farmers and free thought, one aligned with liberty, the people, and France. The revolution had created a nation, but not agreement on what that nation should be. Even before Adams took office, foreign affairs set the stage for crisis. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution, once celebrated by Americans as a sister revolution, had descended into terror. France, now at war with Britain, demanded America's loyalty. But Washington had chosen neutrality, and Adams vowed to continue it. France saw neutrality as betrayal. In 1797, French privateers began seizing American ships bound for British ports. Diplomacy turned scandalous when French agents demanded bribes from U.S. envoys just to begin negotiations. Adams, outraged, refused. He reported the incident to Congress, naming the agents only as X, Y, and Z. The XYZ affair ignited a wave of fury across America. Crowds shouted, "Millions for defense," but not 1 cent for tribute. War fever spread. The young nation braced for conflict with its former ally. Congress authorized the creation of the Department of the Navy. American ships clashed with French vessels in the Caribbean. Though no formal declaration came, the quasi-war had begun an undeclared naval conflict that tested the Republic's resolve. Adams, a man of intellect but not charisma, faced a divided cabinet dominated by Hamilton's influence. His Federalist allies urged him toward war. His conscience urged restraint. Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war, he warned. Against political pressure, Adams chose peace. In 1800, he sent new envoys to France, securing a treaty that ended hostilities. It was a triumph of principle and a death blow to his popularity. While Adams defended peace abroad, turmoil deepened at home. Fear of foreign plots and domestic sedition gripped the Federalists. In 1798, they pushed through Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts for laws designed to silence dissent. The acts extended the waiting period for immigrants to become citizens, allowed the president to deport dangerous aliens, and criminalized criticism of the government. To Adams's supporters, these were measures of national security. To Jefferson's followers, they were shackles on the soul of liberty. Newspapers were shut down. Editors were jailed. In the land that had proclaimed freedom of speech, words themselves had become crimes. Jefferson and James Madison answered with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, declaring that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. It was the first great test of where ultimate power resided in the federal government or in the states. The debate would echo through American history, from secession to Civil War. As the election of 1800 approached, America teetered on the edge of collapse. The Federalists accused Jefferson of atheism and anarchy. The Republicans accused Adams of monarchy and tyranny. The nation that had once stood united under Washington was now consumed by faction. And yet, amid the bitterness, democracy endured. The people voted. When the results came, the outcome was astonishing: a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both of the same party. The decision passed to the House of Representatives, where Federalists sought to block Jefferson's rise. For 35 ballots, the Republic hung in the balance. Finally, in February 1801, after days of deadlock and quiet persuasion by Alexander Hamilton himself, who, though Jefferson's rival, feared Burr's ambition more, Jefferson was elected the third President of the United States. For the first time, power had passed not merely from one man to another, but from one party to its opponent, peacefully, lawfully, without revolution or bloodshed. The world had never seen its like. In his inaugural address, Jefferson reached across the divide. "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans." His words healed what politics had torn. For a moment, the American experiment breathed again. John Adams, humiliated and heartbroken, left the Capitol before dawn, the first president to leave office defeated. Yet in doing so, he upheld the very principle that defined the Revolution. That government belonged not to men, but to laws. Not to parties, but to the people. The crisis of freedom had been survived. The Republic had been tested by war abroad, repression at home, and venomous division within. And yet, it endured. From that storm emerged a lesson that would shape every generation to come: that liberty and power are forever in tension, and that the survival of the Republic depends not on force, but on faith. Faith in the Constitution, in the rule of law, and in the peaceful will of the governed. As Adams returned to his quiet home in Quincy, and Jefferson rode toward his own in Monticello, both men rivals, patriots, philosophers had secured something larger than victory. They had proven that freedom could withstand disagreement, that revolution could evolve into governance, and that the dream born in rebellion could survive in peace. The age of Jefferson, liberty, expansion, and the new republic, 1801 to 1815, the dawn of the 19th century, rose over a nation barely 25 years old. 13 colonies had become 17 states. The revolution had been won, the Constitution written, and the first test of power survived. Now, under Thomas Jefferson, the United States stood at the threshold of its destiny, a republic ready to define what liberty truly meant. Jefferson came to power promising simplicity. He walked to his inauguration instead of riding in a carriage, greeted guests in plain clothes, and cut the pomp of government that he saw as royal excess. He believed that America's strength lay not in cities or banks, but in the soil, in the independence of farmers, each their own master, owing allegiance only to freedom and the land. The sum of good government, Jefferson declared, is a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, and shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits. It was a radical vision, a nation of citizens, not subjects. But liberty would soon be tested, not by ideals, but by empire. In 1803, a single event changed the map of the world: the Louisiana Purchase. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had reclaimed vast lands west of the Mississippi. But Napoleon, at war with Europe, needed money more than territory. When Jefferson's envoys sought to buy New Orleans, Napoleon offered the entire Louisiana Territory, a wilderness stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Rockies. For $15 million, the United States doubled in size overnight. It was a bargain beyond imagination, minus 828,000 square miles of forests, rivers, and frontier. Yet Jefferson faced a paradox. The Constitution, which he revered, did not explicitly grant the president's authority to buy land. The man who had once denounced broad government power now stretched it. But he accepted the contradiction in the name of opportunity. For Jefferson, the future of liberty lay westward. To explore that vast unknown, he turned to his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and a fellow soldier, William Clark. In 1804, they set out from St. Louis on an expedition across uncharted lands, guided by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman whose courage and knowledge of the terrain saved the mission countless times. The Lewis and Clark expedition became the nation's first great journey, a story of endurance, discovery, and diplomacy. They mapped the Missouri River, crossed the Rockies, and reached the Pacific in 1805. Their return in 1806 transformed imagination into geography. The American frontier was no longer a dream, it was destiny. But expansion came at a cost. As settlers pushed west, native nations faced pressure, displacement, and betrayal. Jefferson's vision of liberty did not extend equally to all. The republic that proclaimed freedom continued to hold enslaved people in bondage, and the contradiction deepened. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe was once again at war. Britain and France, locked in global conflict, both sought to strangle the other's trade, and America, neutral but prosperous, found itself caught in the middle. British ships stopped American vessels, searching them for deserters. American sailors were seized and pressed into service under the British flag. Outrage swept the nation. The cry of liberty was renewed on the seas. In 1807, Jefferson responded not with war, but with restraint. He persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act, banning all American exports, He hoped to starve the warring nations into respect. Instead, it crippled the U.S. economy. Merchants went bankrupt. Smuggling flourished. The ports of New England fell silent. The embargo became Jefferson's greatest failure. It was repealed in 1809, just as he left office. He retired to Monticello, weary but unbroken, believing still in reason, progress, and the hope that America might someday live up to its ideals. His successor, James Madison, inherited the storm. Where Jefferson had avoided war, Madison would be consumed by it. British aggression continued. On the frontier, British agents armed native tribes against American settlers. In Congress, young nationalists, known as war hawks, demanded action. They saw British insult as a threat to American honor and sovereignty. In June 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. It was the first time the young republic had declared war, and it was unprepared. The War of 1812 began in confusion and hope. American forces invaded Canada, expecting liberation. Instead, they met disaster. Detroit fell. The capital at York was burned. Yet the tide slowly turned on the Great Lakes, where Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry declared victory at the Battle of Lake Erie, proclaiming, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Meanwhile, the struggle raged on the frontier. Native resistance, led by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, sought to unite tribes in defense of their homelands. Tecumseh's vision was noble, a confederation of nations standing against expansion, but his alliance was shattered at the Battle of Tippecanoe and later destroyed when he fell in battle in 1813. His dream died, but his legacy endured, the last great effort of native unity east of the Mississippi. In 1814, Britain turned its full might against America after defeating Napoleon. British troops landed on the Chesapeake and marched on Washington. The Capitol burned the White House and the Capitol reduced to smoking ruins. Yet even in ashes, the Republic refused to die. At Baltimore, American defenders held firm at Fort McHenry. As bombs exploded over the harbor, a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched from a ship offshore. When dawn broke and the flag still waved, he penned a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, that would one day become the nation's anthem. Soon after, British forces moved south to seize New Orleans. There they met a defiant American general, Andrew Jackson, the ragtag army of soldiers, frontiersmen, and freedmen. Jackson crushed the British assault in January 1815. Ironically, the battle was fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent had ended the war, news that had not yet crossed the Atlantic, but the victory gave America a hero and a sense of pride it had never known before. The war ended in stalemate. No borders changed, no spoils gained, but something profound had shifted. The United States had fought the world's greatest empire to a draw, and it had survived. The Revolution had given independence. The War of 1812 gave identity. Across the nation, a new generation was rising, a generation that saw itself not as subjects of states, but as citizens of a country. Factories began to hum. Roads and canals knit the land together. The flag that had survived the bombardment at Fort McHenry became a symbol not of fragility, but of permanence. The age of Jefferson had begun as a dream of liberty and simplicity. It ended as the dawn of American power. From Monticello to New Orleans, from the frontier to the capital, the Republic had endured its growing pains, balancing idealism with necessity, peace with pride, and freedom with expansion. The United States entered 1815 larger, prouder, and more confident than ever before. It had proven that the experiment of liberty could not only govern, it could endure. The dream of a republic had survived the fire, and from its embers, a nation began to rise. The era of good feelings, America's illusion of unity, 1815 to 1825. The guns of the War of 1812 had fallen silent. And for the first time in a generation, the young republic stood without an enemy. The nation that had once trembled on the edge of collapse now looked westward with confidence. From the ashes of war, a sense of triumph filled the land, a belief that America's destiny was to grow, prosper, and lead. It was called the era of good feelings, but beneath the calm, cracks were already forming. In 1817, James Monroe took the oath of office as the 5th President of the United States. A veteran of the Revolution, a statesman of quiet dignity, Monroe embodied the virtues of unity and moderation. He traveled across the nation to heal wounds between North and South, East and West. Crowds greeted him as a hero, the last of the Founding Fathers to hold the presidency. Under Monroe, partisan lines faded. The old Federalist Party, battered by its opposition to the War of 1812, collapsed into obscurity. For a brief shining moment, it seemed America had no enemies, foreign or domestic. The country was booming. New industries rose in New England. The Cotton Kingdom expanded in the South. Settlers poured westward, cutting roads through wilderness, founding towns beyond the Appalachians. Canals and turnpikes connected regions that had once stood worlds apart. The Erie Canal, begun in 1817, would soon link the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, tying the interior of the continent to global markets. The American system, championed by Henry Clay, promised a self-sufficient nation built on internal improvements, a national bank, and protective tariffs to foster industry. For a moment, it seemed that unity could be engineered, and prosperity could bind where politics had divided. But prosperity had its price. As the new economy expanded, speculation soared. Banks lent freely, credit flowed, and dreams of instant fortune spread. Then, in 1819, the illusion shattered. The panic of 1819 struck like a storm. Banks failed, land values collapsed. Farmers lost their homes. It was the first major financial crisis in American history, a harsh lesson in capitalism's volatility. To many, it was a betrayal of the promise of independence. For the first time, citizens looked not across the ocean for blame, but inward, toward the flaws of their own system. Even as the nation recovered, a deeper crisis stirred, one not of money, but of morality. Westward expansion had raised an impossible question. Would slavery follow the flag? In 1819, Missouri applied for statehood. It sought admission as a slave state, but its entry would tip the delicate balance between free and slave states in the Senate. For months, Congress raged in bitter debate. To the North, slavery was a contradiction of the nation's ideals. To the South, it was a foundation of economy and society, one they would defend as essential to their survival. The debate revealed a truth long buried. America was two nations sharing one constitution. At last, compromise prevailed. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, crafted by Henry Clay, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free one, preserving the balance. But it also drew a line, the 3,630 parallel, forbidding slavery north of it in future territories. It was a fragile truce, not a solution. The question of slavery was not answered, only postponed. While Congress wrestled with its conscience, Monroe turned his gaze abroad. In Latin America, revolutions swept through Spanish colonies, echoes of America's own struggle for freedom. The United States, sympathetic but cautious, watched as new republics emerged from Buenos Aires to Mexico. In 1823, Monroe issued what would become one of the most enduring declarations in American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. It warned European powers that any attempt to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere would be seen as an act of aggression. America for the Americans, it proclaimed a bold statement of independence and defiance. But behind its confidence lay the quiet hand of Britain. The Royal Navy, not the American fleet, ensured that no European empire would test the warning. Still, the doctrine gave the United States a moral voice, the promise that this new world would not fall again to the old world's chains. At home, nationalism flourished. Artists, writers, and educators began to speak of an American identity distinct from Europe's refinement or monarchy. Noah Webster's dictionary gave the English language an American shape. Painters celebrated vast landscapes and frontier life. Schools taught the Revolution as sacred origin and the Founding Fathers as mythic figures. It was an age of pride, but also of forgetting. The era of good feelings glossed over the deep divisions that would one day tear the nation apart. The widening gulf between rich and poor, between industrial North and agricultural South, between the ideals of liberty and the institution of slavery. When Monroe's presidency drew to a close in 1825, he left office beloved and unchallenged. The nation was prosperous, expanding, and at peace. But the unity of the era had been an illusion, a calm surface masking turbulent waters below. The next generation would inherit the storm. New leaders, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, stood ready to claim the future, each carrying a vision of what America should become. Monroe had presided over an age of optimism. What followed would be an age of conflict. For the first time, Americans would turn their struggles not against a king or empire, but against one another over what freedom meant and who would truly possess it. The era of good feelings had promised unity, but its legacy would be something else, a fragile peace before the awakening, a golden mirage before the storm. The Age of Jackson and the Rise of Democracy, 1825 to 1830. The harmony of the era of good feelings ended not with war, but with an election. In 1824, the illusion of unity shattered, and from its pieces, a new kind of politics was born. The United States had grown. Its border stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Its population had tripled, and its frontier pulsed with restless energy. The Revolution's generation was passing away, and a new one, raised in independence and ambition, demanded to be heard. The presidency of James Monroe faded quietly, but his successor would emerge from conflict, not consensus. For men sought the highest office: John Quincy Adams, son of the nation's second president; Henry Clay, the eloquent Speaker of the House; William Crawford of Georgia, favored by old Jeffersonians; and Andrew Jackson, a war hero with little political polish but immense popular appeal. Jackson was different. He was not born to privilege. He had no family name, no university education, no wealth. He was born in a log cabin, orphaned young, scarred by war, and forged by frontier life. He was the embodiment of the self-made American, proud, stubborn, and uncompromising. To his followers, he was the people's champion. To his enemies, he was a dangerous demagogue. When the votes were counted, Jackson won more popular votes and more electoral votes than any other candidate, but not a majority. Under the Constitution, the decision passed to the House of Representatives. There, Henry Clay, eliminated from contention, but still wielding influence, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams won the presidency. Shortly after, he appointed Clay as Secretary of State, the same office that had launched every president since Jefferson. To Jackson's supporters, it was an outrage, the corrupt bargain. They saw in it proof that Washington's elite had stolen power from the people. In that moment, American politics changed forever. The old system of gentlemen's agreement and quiet consensus was gone. In its place rose a new force, organized, emotional, democratic. The Age of Jackson had begun. Adams's presidency, though visionary, was doomed from the start. He was an intellectual, devoted to progress, championing roads, canals, science, and education. But his lofty ideals alienated the common man. In the new political climate, aristocratic virtue was no longer admired. It was resented. Jackson and his allies built something unprecedented, a political machine fueled by popular passion. They called themselves Democrats. And their message was simple: power belonged not to the privileged few, but to the people. Across the nation, Jackson's image spread in newspapers, taverns, and town halls. He was Old Hickory, strong, unyielding, the hero of New Orleans. His name became a rallying cry for farmers, mechanics, and frontiersmen who felt ignored by the government in Washington. In 1828, the people struck back. The presidential campaign that followed was the dirtiest in American history up to that point. A bitter war of words, slander, and propaganda. Adams's supporters called Jackson a murderer, a tyrant, even an adulterer. Jackson's followers branded Adams a corrupt aristocrat, unfit to represent a free people. The battle divided families, churches, and towns. But in the end, it wasn't just an election. It was a revolution at the ballot box. Andrew Jackson won by a landslide. For the first time, power shifted not between factions of the elite, but from the elite to the electorate. The Revolution of 1828, as some called it, marked the birth of modern American democracy. On March 4, 1829, tens of thousands of ordinary citizens flooded Washington for Jackson's inauguration. They came from farms and villages, arriving in wagons and on foot to witness one of their own ascend to the presidency. As Jackson took the oath, the crowd roared. The barriers between ruler and ruled vanished. When the ceremony ended, the celebration spilled into the White House, literally. Hundreds pushed through the doors, tracking mud across the carpets, breaking china, and toasting their victory. To the elite, it was mob rule. To the people, it was liberation. Jackson's rise signaled more than a political triumph. It was a cultural shift. He embodied the spirit of the age, restless, defiant, and democratic. His presidency would expand the power of the executive branch and redefine the relationship between the people and their government. For the first time, the presidency was not a distant institution of scholars and statesmen. It was the voice of the common man. Jackson's America believed that political power should not be the privilege of birth or wealth, but the right of every citizen. But democracy, as it always does, came with contradictions. The same people who cheered the fall of aristocracy often ignored the cries of those left outside that democracies promise. Women remained voiceless. Millions of enslaved people remained in chains. Native nations, whose lands Jackson supporters coveted, would soon face expulsion and tragedy. The age of Jackson was both a triumph and a test, a bold experiment in popular power and the beginning of America's long, uneasy struggle to define what the people truly meant. As the 1830s dawned, the United States stood transformed. Politics had become the people's theater. Elections became mass spectacles, newspapers became weapons, and loyalty to party became the new badge of identity. The republic born in revolution had entered its next evolution, a nation ruled not by elites but by voters. Not by reason alone, but by passion. The revolution had given freedom. The Federalists had given structure. And now Andrew Jackson had given it voice. The United States had entered the age of democracy, powerful, divisive, and unstoppable.